The scent of oil and ozone was Caleb Miller's oxygen in the dim, fluorescent-lit belly of Miller & Sons Auto Repair, where he was a king, solving tangible problems far from human chaos. While outside, Muncie, Indiana painted itself in fall golds, but inside the garage was perpetually a grimy summer afternoon as Derek Kovac's voice boomed, followed by a wrench's clang, saying, "You're thinking about it again," with his permanent grin leaning against a '98 Ford pickup's fender, adding, "It's just a date, not an engine rebuild," while Chad Reynolds snickered from the driver's seat, pretending to check air vents and saying, "Yeah, man, Elise is nice, really, sophisticated. You'll like her, or she'll tolerate you. Either way, free dinner, right?" Making Caleb wipe his hands on a hopelessly stained rag, slowly looking at his two oldest friends from high school football days, where Derek was the loudmouthed linebacker and Chad the sneaky wide receiver who now sold telecom contracts and found their excitement in pranks that felt increasingly hollow to Caleb, who knew this date was their latest joke because why would a woman named Elise from the gleaming sidewalks of Carmel ever agree to meet a grease monkey from Muncie unless she was in on the punchline? But Caleb's father had taught him to face problems head-on, so he simply nodded, muttering, "Fine, the Rusty Nail, 7 p.m., which was the oldest diner in town, with cracked vinyl seats and a jukebox playing 80s hits, where he'd feel less out of place. And Derek's eyes lit up with glee as he slapped Chad's back, whispering, "This is gonna be classic," while Caleb already felt the familiar weight of being the butt of the joke again, though he didn't know the real punchline was that Elise Vandermeer was sitting in her modest rented apartment in downtown Indianapolis, staring at the diner's address on her phone sent by a guy named Derek, whom she'd met exactly once at a charity gala where he'd spent 20 minutes boasting about his sales numbers, and she'd given a fake number to be polite. But he'd somehow connected via a mutual acquaintance, and now his friend Caleb wanted to meet at some place called the Rusty Nail, which sounded absurd to her, but also intriguingly real, unlike the sterile five-star restaurant she usually frequented with sons of her father's associates, men who discussed stock portfolios in yacht lengths. So she texted back a simple, "See you then," and went to find an outfit that wouldn't scream Arthur Vandermeer's daughter. Because she was tired of that role, tired of being a prize to be won in a game she never agreed to play. And as she chose simple jeans and a sweater, she wondered if this Caleb was just another gold digger who'd discovered her identity. But something in Derek's clumsy message suggested otherwise, suggesting a genuine cluelessness that was either an excellent act or refreshingly authentic, and she decided to go find out. Well, back at the garage, closing time arrived, and Caleb scrubbed his hands raw under industrial soap, trying to remove the permanent grit from his cuticles, knowing it would never fully come out. Just like the memory of his father's last words in this very garage 2 years ago. "Keep the doors open, son. It's all we have." A promise that was a chain and a purpose. And as he pulled on his only clean jacket, a faded denim one, he looked at the framed photo on the cluttered office wall of his dad smiling next to the first car they'd fixed together, a '65 Mustang, and Caleb whispered, "Doing my best, Pop," before heading out into the crisp evening, walking because his own truck was on the lift, in need of a new fuel pump he couldn't yet afford, and the walk to the Rusty Nail was 15 minutes of anxious rehearsal of what to say to a woman like Elise, who probably expected fine wine talk, not carburetor chat. And he was so lost in thought, he didn't see the sleek black Audi gliding past him, its driver, Elise Vandermeer herself, using GPS to navigate the unfamiliar streets of Muncie, feeling a mix of foolishness and adventure as she spotted the neon sign of the diner buzzing against the twilight and parked her car, which cost more than the diner's yearly revenue, right beside a beat-up sedan, taking a deep breath before stepping out into the cool air just as Caleb turned the corner and saw her, standing there, illuminated by the neon glow, looking not like a snob, but like someone slightly lost and incredibly beautiful in a way that wasn't polished magazine beauty, but something real that made his heart do a strange stutter in his chest. And she turned and saw him, a tall man with broad shoulders and kind, tired eyes in a denim jacket, hands shoved in his pockets, and she knew instantly this was Caleb, and the carefully constructed suspicion in her mind cracked because he looked nothing like a gold digger. He looked like a man who carried weight, and for the first time in a long time, Elise Vandermeer felt a spark of genuine curiosity, not about his net worth, but about him, as she offered a small, tentative smile and said, "Caleb." And he nodded, clearing his throat and managing, "Elise, nice to meet you. Hope you didn't get lost." And she laughed, a real laugh that surprised them both, saying, "Just a little. The GPS wasn't sure what to make of the rusty nail." And he held the diner door open for her, the bell jingling as they stepped into the warmth of grease and coffee and classic rock, and to both their astonishment, the awkwardness melted away, not into polished conversation, but into something better, something real, as they slid into a corner booth with a sticky table and a view of the parking lot, where her Audi sat like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong century, and she saw him glance at it once, but without the usual greed or calculation, just a mechanic's mild professional interest, as he said, "Audi S7, nice engine. The twin-turbo V8 can be tricky with the direct injection, carbon buildup though." And she blinked, surprised, because every other man who'd ever commented on that car had called it sexy or a beast, not diagnosed its potential maintenance issues, and she found herself smiling, saying, "Is that so? I'll keep that in mind." And their waitress Marge, a woman who'd worked there since before Caleb was born, came over with a knowing smile at Caleb, saying, "The usual, sweetie, and for the lady," and Caleb's ears went pink as he nodded, and Elise, feeling playful, said, "I'll have what he's having," and Marge winked, saying, "2 Miller specials coming up," which turned out to be giant cheeseburgers with extra pickles, onion rings, and chocolate milkshakes. And as they waited, Caleb asked her what brought her to Muncie, and Elise, who had prepared a lie about being a junior marketing consultant, stumbled over her words because his gaze was so direct and unassuming, and instead she heard herself say, "I needed to see something real," and immediately regretted it, fearing it sounded dramatic, but Caleb just nodded slowly as if that made perfect sense, saying, "Well, Muncie's real. Sometimes too real. The potholes on Madison Street will convince you of that." And she laughed again and asked about the garage, and his face lit up with a passion she'd never seen in the boardrooms of her father's world as he described the satisfaction of diagnosing a problem no one else could, the beauty of a well-tuned engine. And he spoke not to impress her, but because it was his life, and she listened, fascinated by this world of torque wrenches and timing belts, a universe away from her own of quarterly reports and stock dividends. And when the food came, they ate with their hands and talked about small things, favorite movies. She loved old black and white classics. He had a soft spot for 80s action flicks. And music, she preferred jazz, he liked classic rock, and they argued good-naturedly about the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones, and he admitted he played guitar a little, a skill learned from his dad on slow evenings in the garage. And she confessed she'd always wanted to learn, but her piano lessons had been about discipline, not joy. And the hours slipped away until Marge was refilling their coffee for the 3rd time and giving them a look that said, "You two are cute." And outside the neon buzzed louder in the deepening dark, and at least realized with a start that she hadn't checked her phone once, that the usual anxious buzz in her chest about meetings and appearances and expectations had been completely silent for 3 whole hours, and the feeling was so foreign that it was exhilarating and terrifying. And she looked at Caleb, who was quietly finishing his last onion ring, and she knew, without a doubt, this was no joke.
Absolute certainty that he had no idea who she was, that to him she was just Elise, the girl from Carmel who liked jazz and hated pickles on her burger, which she'd picked off and he'd eaten without comment. And this anonymity was a gift she hadn't known she craved. And as the check came, Caleb reached for it instantly, saying, "I asked you out." And she protested, but he was firm, his pride quiet and solid. And she let him pay the $24.37, knowing it was a significant sum for him, and respecting it more than any $1,000 dinner bought with a black credit card. And as they stepped out into the chilly night, the magic of the booth seemed to waver in the open air, and the reality of their separate lives rushed back in. And Elise felt a pang of loss for something she'd just found. And Caleb shoved his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground, then at her, saying, "I had a really good time, Elise." And she said, "Me too, Caleb, more than you know." And they stood there in the pool of neon light, not sure how to end this, because a handshake felt absurd, and a hug felt too soon. And then a loud, obnoxious voice cut through the night. "Well, well, look what we have here!" And they both turned to see Derek and Chad stumbling out of O'Malley's bar across the street, clearly several beers deep, their faces flush with alcohol and cruel amusement. And Derek elbowed Chad, saying, "I told you he'd still be here, trying to figure out how to kiss her." And Chad howled with laughter. And Caleb's entire body went rigid, his face shutting down into a mask of stoic resignation, as if he'd been expecting this blow all along. And Elise felt a hot surge of protective anger as Derek swaggered over, slurring, "So, Elise, how was the charity case? We got you a good fixer-upper, right? Maybe you can take 'em home, buff out the scratches." And Caleb said quietly, painfully, "Derek, shut up." But Derek was on a roll, fueled by beer and his own insecurity, and he leaned into Elise's space, his breath sour, saying, "What's the matter, princess? Not used to slumming it?" And before Caleb could move, Elise stepped forward, her voice cold and sharp as a diamond blade, cutting through Derek's drunken haze. "The only charity case I see here is you two, grown men so bored with your own pathetic lives you have to manufacture amusement by hurting your friend," she said, each word precise and laced with a venomous contempt that came from a lifetime of dealing with far more dangerous men than these. And Derek blinked, stunned by the force of her. And Chad took a step back, and Elise turned to Caleb, her eyes softening. And she did something then that she hadn't planned. She reached out and took his grease-stained, calloused hand in hers, lacing their fingers together, and she looked right at Derek and Chad and said the words that would change everything. "You set him up as a prank. You thought I'd be your punchline, but you failed because I like him. I choose him. So you can run back to your sad little world and tell everyone your joke backfired." And with that, she turned, pulling Caleb gently towards Harati, and said, "Come on, I'll give you a ride home." And Caleb, in a daze of shock and awe, let her lead him to the passenger side. She opened the door for him, and he got in, still holding her hand as if it were a lifeline. And she walked around, got in, started the engine with a quiet purr, and drove away, leaving Derek and Chad gaping on the sidewalk in the fading neon glow. And for the first minute in the car, there was only the sound of the heater and their breathing. And then Caleb said, "You didn't have to do that." And Elise, keeping her eyes on the road, said, "Yes, I did." And he gave her directions to his house, a small, run-down bungalow on the edge of town with the garage out back. And when she pulled into the short driveway, he didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he turned to her, and in the dim light from the dashboard, his eyes were full of a wounded honesty, as he said, "Why did you really come out tonight, Elise?" And she took a deep breath, knowing the bubble was about to pop, and she said, "Because I was lonely, and because my name isn't just Elise, it's Elise Vandermeer, and my father is Arthur Vandermeer." And she watched his face carefully for the flash of recognition, the greed, the calculation. But it wasn't there. There was only blank confusion as he said, "Okay, is that supposed to mean something?" And the genuine puzzlement in his voice was the final proof she needed that he was the realest thing she'd ever touched. And she laughed a little hysterically, saying, "It means he's the owner of Vandermeer Logistics. It means he's a billionaire. It means my trust fund could buy this entire town 10 times over." And Caleb stared, processing, and then he did something extraordinary. He started to laugh, a low, rich sound of pure irony, and he said, "So that's the joke, huh? The ultimate punchline, the billionaire's daughter. Derek and Chad, they must be losing their minds right now." But his laughter died as he saw the tears glimmering in her eyes, and he reached out with his free hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb wiping away a single escaping tear, and he said softly, "Hey, it doesn't change anything. You're still the girl who hates pickles and likes weird old movies." And she leaned into his touch, a touch that asked for nothing, and she whispered, "It changes everything, Caleb." And he said, "Only if we let it." And they sat there in the dark car, in his crumbling driveway, two people from different worlds, holding on to something fragile and new, and neither knowing that across town Derek and Chad were already on Google typing Vandermeer, and their jaws were hitting the floor as article after article about Arthur Vandermeer, the reclusive logistics titan, appeared, and a photo from a charity gala showing a younger Elise on his arm confirmed their worst nightmare, that their prank had not just backfired, it had detonated a bomb in their own laps. And Derek, in a panic, called his uncle, who worked in warehouse security for a company that was a subcontractor for Vandermeer, and whispered, "We might have a problem, a big problem," while Chad started drinking straight from a whiskey bottle. And back in the car, Elise finally pulled away, saying, "I should go." And Caleb nodded and got out, but before he closed the door, he leaned in and said, "Thank you for tonight, for choosing me, even if it was just to spite them." And she looked at him and said, "It wasn't." And then she drove away, leaving him standing in the dark. And Caleb walked into his silent house, the smell of oil and solitude greeting him, but for the first time it smelled lonely. And he looked at his hands, still faintly holding the scent of her perfume, something light and clean like rain, and he knew nothing would ever be the same. While Elise drove the hour back to Indianapolis, her mind racing through the implications, her father's rules, the carefully guarded privacy, the vultures who circled her for her name, and now she had dragged a good man into that world. And the guilt warred with the wild elation she had felt, holding his hand, standing up to those fools, claiming him. And when she got home to her secure high-rise apartment, she saw 5 missed calls from her father's personal assistant, Marcus, and her heart sunk, because the only way her father could have found out was if someone had already talked. And she called back, and Marcus's clipped voice said, "Your father wishes to see you at the estate tomorrow morning at 9. He's been informed about your incident in Muncie." And Elise closed her eyes, the walls of her gilded cage feeling suddenly very, very close, and she knew the real battle was just beginning, a battle for a chance at something real with a man who fixed cars with careful hands in a garage that smelled of hope and hard work. And far away, Caleb lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, not thinking of billions, but of the way she had stepped in front of him like a shield, and the feeling of her small, strong hand in his, and he knew he was in deep trouble. But for once, it wasn't the kind of trouble he could fix with a wrench and a parts catalog. The morning sun hit the cracked linoleum of Caleb's kitchen with a coolty that felt personal, highlighting every stain and the persistent ghost smell of fried food that no amount of cleaning could erase, and he stood there in yesterday's clothes, having not slept at all, the coffee in his chipped mug tasting like ash, because his mind was a relentless engine, cycling through every moment of the previous night, from Elise's laugh to the cold fury in her voice when she defended him, to the devastating softness of her confession in his driveway. And the word billionaire echoed in the hollow spaces of his life, a sum so abstract it was meaningless next to the very concrete number staring at him from the pile of bills on the counter, the notice from the bank about the garage's mortgage payment, now 90 days past due, a final warning printed in stark black and red, and the estimated tax bill for the property that made his stomach clench, and the voicemail from the supplier about an overdue parts account, and Caleb pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until he saw sparks, because last night he had felt for a few hours like a man in a dream, and now he was awake, and the dream was a taunt, and he was just Caleb Miller, drowning in debts his father had left behind and promises he couldn't keep. But then he remembered the feel of her fingers laced through his, and the way she'd said, "I choose him," with such fierce certainty, and the memory was a lifeline and an anchor both, and he knew he had to go to the garage and work, because work was the only prayer he knew how to say. So he left the bills untouched and walked out into the cool morning air, his breath fogging, passing his own truck still helpless on the lift, its fuel pump sitting in a box on the bench, waiting for a day when he could afford the gaskets and the time. And he unlocked the bay doors, rolling them up with a familiar clatter that echoed in the empty space. And the silence of the garage without his father's old radio playing classic rock was a presence itself. And he went to the office, a cramped room overflowing with manuals and invoices, and the framed photo of his dad, and he looked at it and said quietly, "I met a girl, Pop. She's something else." And the picture offered no advice, just the same steady smile. And Caleb was about to start on the Ford pickup when his phone buzzed, not a call, but a text from a number not saved. And the message was simple. "It wasn't a dream. Can I see you again? Today. E." And his heart did that stupid stutter again, and he stared at the words, the simplicity of them, the lack of pretense, and he typed back, his thumbs clumsy, "Garage is open, 1217 Elm, not exactly 5-star. And her reply came almost instantly. "Be there by 11. Don't eat lunch." And Caleb looked around his kingdom of grease and rust with a sudden wild panic, and he spent the next 2 hours in a frenzy, not of cloning, because that was a lost cause, but of organizing, of making the chaos look like a functional kind of chaos, wiping down the customer bench, stacking oil cans, straightening tools. He even used a cleaner on the small window, letting in a grudging square of sunlight. And at 10:58, a different car pulled up outside. Not the black Audi, but a sensible silver Honda Civic that looked utterly ordinary, and out of it stepped Elise, wearing faded jeans that had actual wear in the knees, and a soft gray sweatshirt, her hair in a simple ponytail. And she looked so normal, so beautiful it stole the air from his lungs. And she walked into the garage, not flinching at the smell, just taking it in, her eyes wide and curious. And she found him standing by the workbench, holding a carburetor like a talisman, and she smiled a little shyly and said, "Hi." And he said, "Hi." And for a moment they just looked at each other, and then she held up a brown paper bag. "I brought sandwiches from a deli near my place, best pastrami in Indy." And he nodded and said, "We can eat in the office." And he led her into the small room, having cleared a space on the desk, and they sat on old rolling chairs and ate the sandwiches, which indeed were incredible, and for a few minutes it was easy again, just two people sharing a meal. And then Elise put her sandwich down and said, "My father knows." And the words landed between them heavy as an anvil, and Caleb stopped chewing, and she continued, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying a storm. "Someone from that town, someone who saw us, called someone who called someone, and it got back to his security detail before I even got home last night. I have a meeting with him tomorrow at the family estate." And Caleb swallowed. "What does that mean?" And Elise looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "It means he'll investigate you. He'll run a full background check. He'll have your financials, your history, your whole life on a report by tomorrow. And then he'll try to buy you off or scare you off, probably both." And Caleb felt a cold wash of shame, thinking of the bills on his counter, the delinquent mortgage, the pitiful balance of his bank account laid bare for a billionaire scrutiny. And he set his sandwich down, his appetite gone. "So that's it then," he said, the resignation already settling in his bones. But Elise reached across the desk and grabbed his hand. "No, Caleb, that is not it. I told you I choose you. I meant it. I'm not a child. I'm 27 years old, and I have a law degree I don't use and a trust fund I don't touch, because I want a life, not a ledger. But my father, he's used to controlling things, to protecting the family name, and you are an unexpected variable." And Caleb looked at their joined hands, her skin so clean against his permanently stained knuckles. "Why you, Elise? You could have anyone." And she smiled a sad smile. "Anyone? You mean any of the hundreds of men who see the name Vandermeer and see a finish line? The ones who want to own me like they'd want to own a sports car or a painting? You saw me last night, not the name, you saw me, and you didn't ask for a single thing. You just shared your onion rings." And she laughed a little wetly. "It's the first genuine thing I've had in years." and Caleb's throat was tight. "I don't know how to be in your world, Elise." And she squeezed his hand. "And I don't know how to be in yours, but I want to learn, and I want you to be in mine. Not the gilded cage part, but the real parts, if there are any left." And he was about to answer when the bell on the garage's front door jingled, and a voice called out, "Caleb, you in here?" And it was Derek, and Caleb felt Elise's hand tense, but she didn't let go. And second later, Derek appeared in the office doorway, followed by a pale and sweating Chad. And Derek's cocky grin was gone, replaced by a sickly, nervous energy, and his eyes darted from Caleb to Elise and back, and he said, "Cale, man, we need to talk." And Caleb stood up slowly, releasing Elise's hand. "We don't have anything to talk about, Derek." But Derek stepped forward, his hands up. "Look, we're sorry, okay? It was a stupid joke. It got out of hand. We didn't know who she was." And his eyes flicked to Elise with a mixture of fear and awe. And Chad mumbled, "Yeah, man, we're really sorry." And Caleb felt a hot anger rise. "You're sorry you got caught? You're sorry she's someone who could squash you like a bug? You weren't sorry when you thought she was just some girl you could humiliate along with me?" And Derek flinched. "It wasn't like that." But Elise stood then, and though she was shorter than all of them, she seemed to fill the small room with an imperious coldness. "It was exactly like that," she said, her voice cutting. "You used your friend for your amusement, and you assumed I would be willing to participate in his humiliation. Your character is as small as your imagination." And Derek's face flushed red with a mixture of shame and anger. "And what, you're slumming it for kicks? How long before you get bored and go back to your castles, princess?" And Caleb took a step forward, but Elise put her hand on his arm, stopping him. And she looked at Derek with a pity so profound it was
Worse than hatred. The difference is I see him. You never did. And she turned to Caleb. "I should go. I have preparations to make." And Caleb walked her out to her car, leaving Derek and Chad standing awkwardly in the office, and at her car she turned to him. "Tomorrow will be hard. Whatever my father says, whatever he offers or threatens, remember this." And she stood on her toes and kissed him softly on the cheek, a whisper of warmth and the scent of rain. And then she got in her car and drove away, and Caleb stood watching until the car vanished. Then he turned and walked back into the garage, where Derek and Chad were still waiting, looking like schoolboys called to the principal's office. And Caleb felt a profound tiredness. "Get out," he said quietly, and Derek's bravado returned. "Aw, come on, Caleb, don't be like that. We're still your friends. We've known you since we were kids." And Caleb looked at him, his eyes dead. "You haven't been my friend in a long time, Derek. You've been my audience, and I've been your clown. Now get out of my shop before I throw you out." And something in Caleb's tone must have convinced them because they left, muttering, and Caleb was alone again, with the ghosts and the debts and the lingering feel of a kiss on his cheek. And he went back to the Ford pickup and lost himself in the mechanical rhythm of repair, the solid certainty of bolts that needed tightening and gaps that needed measuring, and he worked until his muscles ached and the light faded, and he didn't think about billionaires or estates or the terrifying meeting Elise was facing. He just focused on the task in front of him because it was all he could do. Meanwhile, Elise drove not to her apartment but to the sprawling estate in the rolling hills south of Indianapolis known as Ironwood, a place of manicured silence and watchful windows. And she used the private gate code she had been given, but rarely used. And the long driveway through ancient oaks felt like a journey back in time to a prison of polished marble. And she parked her Civic, looking absurdly out of place among the fleet of black luxury vehicles, and was met at the vast front door by Marcus, the personal assistant, a man of impeccable suits and expressionless eyes, who said, "Your father is in the West Library. He's expecting you." And she followed him through the cavernous halls, past artwork worth more than Caleb's entire block, and into the library, a room of dark wood and leather that smelled of old money and older cigars. And there behind a massive desk sat Arthur Vandermeer, a man in his late 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He did not stand as she entered, merely looked up from the tablet in his hands and said, "Elise, sit." His voice a low rumble of contained power. And she sat in the chair opposite him, feeling like a defendant, and he placed the tablet down and steepled his fingers. Caleb Miller, age 29, owner and sole operator of Miller & Sons Auto Repair in Muncie, Indiana. Business is insolvent, mortgage in severe default, Personal savings under $3,000. No criminal record, a few traffic tickets. Mother deceased 5 years ago, breast cancer. Father deceased 2 years ago, heart attack. Left the business deeply in debt. High school graduate, 2 semesters of community college for automotive technology before dropping out to run the garage after his father's death. He recited the facts without inflection, then looked at her. A simple man with simple problems. You understand why this is concerning. And Elise felt a hot rage at the violation. You had no right, she said, her voice trembling. He's a good man. And Arthur's eyebrow lifted a fraction. Good men are a dime a dozen, Elise. What he is poor and desperate, and now he has met a very rich young woman, and that is a dangerous combination. And Elise leaned forward. You think he's a gold digger? He didn't even know who you were. He thought Vandermeer was a brand of spark plugs. And a flicker of something almost amusement crossed her father's face, but it was gone quickly. Naivete is not a virtue, Elise. It is a vulnerability. I will not have you exploited, nor will I have our family become a tabloid spectacle. Billionaire's daughter and the grease monkey. It's undignified. And Elise stood, her hands on the desk. I don't care about dignity. I care about happiness for once in my life, and he makes me happy. And Arthur studied her for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a checkbook. Very well, he said. If his interest is not financial, let's test it. Offer him this. And he wrote with a fountain pen a series of numbers with a flourish, then tore the check out and slid it across the desk. And Elise looked down and saw the amount was for $500,000, and the line read, for business investment and relocation. And she stared at it, feeling sick. What is this? And her father leaned back. A solution. It clears his debts, gives him a fresh start somewhere far from here, far from you. It's more money than he'd see in a lifetime of fixing cars. And if he is the good man you claim, he will take it, and you will never hear from him again. And if he refuses, well, then perhaps you have a point. And Elise's heart hammered. This is a bribe, a test. It's disgusting. And Arthur's eyes turned cold. It is business. It is protecting what is mine, including you. Take the check, give it to him, the choice is his. But know this, Elise. If he takes the money, you cease contact. If he does not, I will not stand in your way. But he will still be investigated, monitored, and the world will not be kind to either of you. The press, the gossip, the assumptions, they will eat him alive and you along with him. So consider carefully whether your affection is a kindness or a curse. And he stood, dismissing her. The meeting is over. I have a conference call with Singapore in 10 minutes. And Elise took the check, the paper feeling like fire in her hand, and she walked out of the library, her legs unsteady. And Marcus appeared as if by magic to escort her out. And when she reached her car, she sat for a long time staring at the check, at the obscene number that represented her father's will. And she knew giving this to him would break something in him, but not giving it would be a lie of omission. And she started the car and drove not back to Indianapolis, but toward Muncie, toward the garage, because she had to tell him, she had to show him, and let the chips fall where they may. And she prayed with a desperation she hadn't felt since her mother died, that he would understand, that he would see this for the ugly test it was, and choose her anyway. It was fully dark when she pulled up to the garage. The bay doors were closed, but a light was on in the office window, and she knocked on the side door, and after a moment it opened, and Caleb stood there, looking exhausted, but his face softened when she saw him, and he stepped aside to let her in. And the office was warm from a space heater, and she stood there clutching her purse, and he said, "How did it go?" And she took a deep breath and pulled out the folded check and handed it to him without a word, and Caleb took it, frowning, and unfolded it, and his eyes scanned the words and the number, and his face went completely blank, then slowly drained of color, and he looked from the check to her and back, and his voice when it came was hollow. "What is this?" And Elise said, "It's a test from my father. He thinks you'll take the money and leave. He thinks that's all you're after." And Caleb stared at the check, his hands beginning to tremble. $500,000, he said, the words sounding alien. "For business investment
and relocation. And he laughed, a sharp, sharp sound with no humor. So, this is what I'm worth to him, a problem to be solved with a check. And he looked at her, his eyes wounded. And you brought it to me. You think I should take it? And Elise shook her head violently. No, Caleb, I brought it because I won't lie to you, because you deserve to know what we're up against. He said if you take it, I never see you again. If you don't, he won't stop us, but he won't make it easy either.
Caleb walked to the window, looking out at the dark street, the check held loosely in his fingers. This would pay off the mortgage, the back taxes, the parts debt. It would leave enough to maybe even expand, hire someone, fix up the place. It would save everything my father built, he said softly. Then he turned to her. And all I have to do is walk away from you? And Elise's heart was in her throat. She said nothing, just waited. And Caleb looked at the check again, at the elegant signature, Arthur Vandermeer. And he thought of his own father's shaky signature on the garage's original loan papers. And he thought of the weight of that promise. And then he thought of Elise standing in the neon light, choosing him. And he walked to the small space heater humming in the corner. And without a word, he held the corner of the check to the glowing coil, and it caught fire. A small, bright flame that climbed quickly, consuming the numbers, the signature, the promise of an easy way out. And he dropped it into a metal trash can, and they both watched it curl into black ash. And Caleb turned to her, his face illuminated by the dying embers. "Tell your father, I'm not for sale," he said. And Elise flew across the room and into his arms. And he caught her, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair, and she was crying and laughing and saying, "I knew it, I knew you wouldn't." And he held her for a long time. And when they finally pulled apart, he cupped her face and said, "But Elise, I'm still broke, and my world is still this." He gestured at the garage. "And your world is that." He pointed at the ash of the check. "How does this work?" And she smiled through her tears. "I don't know, but we'll figure it out together, one day at a time, starting with tomorrow. Can I come by and help? I can hand you tools or something." And Caleb laughed, a real laugh for the first time that day. "You want to hang out in a greasy garage?" And she nodded. "I want to be where you are." And he kissed her then, not on the cheek, but properly, softly at first, then with a building intensity that spoke of fear and hope and a fierce determination. And when they broke apart, both were breathless, and Elise whispered, "I should go." And Caleb nodded, "Yeah." But neither moved for another minute, and then she left, and Caleb sat in his office staring at the ash in the trash can, feeling like he had just jumped off a cliff and was somehow still flying. The next morning, the local Muncie paper had a small business section, and there was a brief article about a new grant program for small legacy businesses in the state. And Caleb read it over his coffee, a tiny seed of an idea beginning to form in his mind. Not about taking her money, but about earning his own way. And he clipped the article and pinned it to his bulletin board next to the photo of his dad, and he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Meanwhile, at Ironwood, Arthur Vandermeer received a report from a discreet security firm that the check had been destroyed. And he listened without expression, then dismissed the agent, and he sat alone in his library for a long time looking out at the grounds, and he allowed himself a small, unreadable smile, because his daughter had spirit, and this mechanic had backbone, and that made the game infinitely more interesting and also infinitely more dangerous. And he picked up the phone and made a call. "I want a deeper dive on Caleb Miller. Everything. His friends, his habits, his character. I want to know what he's made of." Because Arthur Vandermeer was a man who respected strength, and if this man was going to be in his daughter's life, he needed to know if he was worthy or just another kind of fool. And the wheels of power began to turn silently, setting the stage for a conflict that was no longer about money, but about something far more precious: the heart of his only daughter and the soul of a man who had nothing left to lose but his pride. Caleb woke with a start, the ghost of a dream, a check burning, Elise's laugh, the cold eyes of her father still clinging to him. The garage office cot was hard, and the smell of oil was a permanent layer in his lungs. He sat up, the reality of the previous night settling over him like a weight. He had burned $500,000. He had chosen a woman he barely knew over the salvation of everything his father had built. He was either the world's biggest fool, or he looked at the pinched, determined face of his father in the old photograph. Was it courage, Pop, or just another kind of stupid? The photograph offered no answers. The ringing phone did. It was Mrs. Henderson, whose ancient Cadillac was on the lift for a transmission rebuild. "Caleb, honey, any news? I need my car by Thursday for my sister's funeral in Toledo." The desperation in her voice, a mirror of his own, grounded him. This was his world. Real problems, real people. "It'll be ready, Mrs. Henderson, I promise." He hung up and got to work, losing himself in the intricate guts of the Cadillac's transmission. The rhythmic, methodical work was a prayer, a meditation. He didn't hear the sleek car pull up outside an hour later. He didn't hear the door open. He only sensed a presence and looked up from the gear assembly with the wrench in his hand to see Arthur Vandermeer standing in the middle of his garage. The man looked profoundly, absurdly out of place. His overcoat probably cost more than the garage's monthly revenue. He wasn't flanked by bodyguards, just standing there, his winter sky eyes taking in the chaos with detached curiosity. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He slowly set the wrench down and wiped his hands on a rag, more a nervous gesture than a practical one. "Mr. Vandermeer." Arthur gave a single, slight nod. "Mr. Miller, my daughter informed me of your decision regarding my offer." Caleb said nothing, just waited. Arthur took a few steps, running a gloved finger along the fender of Mrs. Henderson's Cadillac, inspecting the dust. "A 1976 Coupe de Ville, a boat. My father had one, dreadful gas mileage." He looked at Caleb. "You are rebuilding the transmission, a complex job for one man." "It's my job," Caleb said, his voice steadier than he felt, "and it will be done on time." Arthur's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Elise says you are an honest man, a man of your word." He paused. "She also says you believe what is between you is real." Caleb met his gaze. "It is." "Prove it," Arthur said, the words dropping into the space between them like stones. "Prove you are not just a stubborn man who saw a bigger payday by playing the long game. Prove you are good for her, not just a distraction from her life." Caleb asked, "How?" The words simple, direct. Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a single plain white business card. He placed it on the workbench next to a jar of bolts. "This Saturday, my annual charity gala at the Vandermeer Gallery in Indianapolis. Black tie. Be there at 8 p.m. sharp. Walk in, find Elise, dance with her. In front of everyone. My colleagues, the press, the entire world she comes from. Let them see you. Let them judge you. Let them dissect you. If you can do that, if you can stand in that room and not fold, then I will have your attention, if not my blessing." Caleb stared at the card. It was thick, expensive stock. Just an address and a date, an invitation to his own execution. "And if I don't come, then you are a man who makes bold gestures in the dark, but fears the light," Arthur said, turning to leave. "And you will never see my daughter again, because I will ensure it, and you will not get another check." He paused at the door. "The choice, as always, is yours." And then he was gone, leaving behind the scent of fine wool and sandalwood, soon swallowed by the garage's odor of grease and metal. Caleb picked up the card. A black tie gala. He didn't own a suit. He'd never worn a tux in his life. He didn't know how to dance. The sheer scale of the impossibility was paralyzing. He looked at the half-rebuilt transmission, at his dirty hands. This was where he belonged, not in some glittering gallery. His phone buzzed. A text from Elise. "He came to see you, didn't he? I'm so sorry. Whatever he said, whatever he wants, ignore it. We don't play by his rules." Caleb typed back, his fingers clumsy. "He invited me to the gala." The typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, appeared again for a long time. Then, oh, that's his move. The trial by fire. "Caleb, you don't have to. It's a snake pit. They'll eat you alive." Caleb thought of Arthur's challenge. Prove you are good for her. He thought of Elise in the diner, laughing. He thought of her standing up to Derek and Chad. She had stepped into his world, unflinching. Could he do any less? "I want to," he typed, "but I don't have anything to wear." Her reply was immediate. "Leave that to me. Just say you'll be there. With me." Caleb took a deep breath, the decision crystallizing. He was already in free fall. He might as well aim for the stars. "I'll be there, 8 p.m. sharp." The next few days were a blur of frantic, secret activity orchestrated by Elise. A tailor from a prestigious boutique in Indianapolis showed up at the garage on Wednesday, measuring Caleb amid the engine blocks, clucking his tongue at the incongruity. Elise had arranged and paid for everything, refusing any argument. "This is my world's ridiculous entry fee," she'd said over the phone. "Let me cover it." Derek and Chad, now unemployed and humbled, heard about the gala through the crumbling Muncie gossip mill. They came to the garage again, not with arrogance, but with a hangdog shame. "We heard about the gala," Derek mumbled. "Caleb, that world, it's vicious. They'll destroy you." Caleb, elbow deep in the Cadillac's oil pan, looked at them. "Why do you care?" Chad spoke up, his voice quiet. "Because we were the vicious ones. And you're still a better guy than we are. We don't want to see you get torn apart by pros." To Caleb's own surprise, he found he believed their concern was genuine, born of guilt and a newfound bitter understanding. "Noted," he said, and went back to work. Saturday arrived, a cold, clear night. The rented tuxedo fit him perfectly, transforming his broad, work-hewn frame into something elegant and powerful. Staring at himself in the small, cracked mirror in his bathroom, he didn't recognize the man looking back. He looked like an imposter. He drove the now-fixed Cadillac to Indianapolis, Mrs. Henderson's keys heavy in his pocket. A borrowed car for a borrowed life. The Vandermeer Gallery was a fortress of glass and light, glowing against the night sky. A river of limousines and luxury cars disgorged men in tuxedos and women in gowns that looked like spun diamond and shadow. Paparazzi flashes erupted like lightning at the red carpet. Caleb parked the enormous Cadillac a block away, a whale among sharks, and walked. He had no invitation, just Arthur's card. At the imposing entrance, a stern-faced man in a suit with an earpiece stopped him. "Name, sir?" "Caleb Miller." The man consulted a tablet, his expression flickering with something, recognition, disdain, pity. He looked Caleb up and down, taking in the perfectly tailored tux, but perhaps seeing the mechanic underneath. "Right this way, Mr. Miller." He was led not through the main throng, but through a side service entrance, past bustling kitchens, and deposited at the edge of the grand ballroom. It was a vision of impossible opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of cars hung from vaulted ceilings. A live orchestra played something smooth and expensive. The air hummed with the low, confident murmur of wealth and power. Hundreds of people moved in a glittering ballet, their laughter sharp and bright. And there, across the sea of silk and champagne, was Elise. She was a vision in a simple, stunning emerald green dress that made her skin glow. She was talking to a group of older men, but her body was tense, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd, looking for him. Caleb felt a wave of pure terror. He was a rock in a river of mercury. He didn't belong. Every instinct screamed to turn and run. Then, as if feeling his gaze, Elise turned. Her eyes found him. The change in her was instantaneous. The practiced social mask dissolved, replaced by a look of such pure, radiant joy and relief that it hit Caleb like a physical force across the room. She excused herself from the group and began to move toward him, cutting through the crowd with single-minded purpose. All eyes followed her, then snapped to him. The murmurs changed, became pointed. He heard snippets. "That's him? The mechanic? What is she thinking? Arthur must be livid."
A man with a camera, not a paparazzi but with an official badge, raised it and snapped a picture of Caleb standing alone. The flash was a tiny explosion of humiliation. Caleb locked his knees, forcing himself to stand straight. Elise reached him. She took both his hands in hers, her touch warm and solid. "You came," she breathed, her eyes shining. "You're here." "I said I would be," he said, his voice rough. She leaned in, kissing him softly on the cheek, a public declaration that sent a fresh ripple through the room. "Let's dance," she said. "I don't really know how," he admitted, the confession tearing at his pride. "Just follow me," she said, and led him onto the dance floor. The orchestra shifted into a waltz. Caleb's world narrowed to Elise's guiding hands, the pressure of her back under his palm, the scent of her perfume, and the feeling of 100 hostile stares drilling into him. He stepped on her foot. He muttered an apology. She just smiled up at him. "You're doing great." And slowly, clumsily, they began to move. It wasn't graceful, but it was real. In a room full of perfect, practiced motion, their imperfect, halting dance was the most authentic thing there. From a balcony overlooking the ballroom, Arthur Vandermeer watched, a crystal glass of bourbon in his hand. Marcus stood beside him. "The vultures are circling, sir. The press line is having a field day. The stock ticker on the business channel just flashed a personal interest alert about Elise." Arthur said nothing, his eyes fixed on the couple on the dance floor. He saw the stiffness in Caleb's shoulders, the determination on his face. He saw the way his daughter looked at the mechanic, as if he were the only person in the universe. He saw Caleb step on her foot again, saw Elise laugh, not in mockery, but in genuine, fond amusement. "He's not running," Arthur murmured, more to himself than Marcus. "He's terrified, but he's not running." Down on the floor, the song ended. As the applause rippled, a tall, silver-haired man with a predatory smile approached. A man Arthur knew well, Richard Thorne, a rival shipping magnate. "Elise, darling, you look breathtaking," Thorne said, his eyes sliding over Caleb like he was a stain on the carpet. "Aren't you going to introduce us to your charming friend?" Elise's grip on Caleb's hand tightened. "Richard, this is Caleb Miller. Caleb, Richard Thorne of Thorne Global." "Miller," Thorne said, not offering a hand. "Unusual name for this crowd. What is it you do, exactly? Venture capital? Tech startup?" Caleb met his gaze. "I'm a mechanic. I own an auto repair shop in Muncie." A beat of silence. Then Thorne's smile widened, becoming cruel. "A mechanic? How rustic. And what brings you to our little gathering? Checking the tire pressure on the limousines?" A few people nearby tittered. Caleb felt the heat of shame on his neck. He saw the trap. He could get angry, look like a brute. He could shrink, look like a coward. He thought of his father, who always said the best way to handle a bully was not with your fists, but by refusing to play the game. He looked at Thorne's custom-made shoes, then back up at his face. "Actually, the Cadillac I drove here has a slight alignment issue. Pulls to the left under heavy braking. You might want to get that looked at, Mr. Thorne. Safety first." His voice was calm, factual. It was a mechanic's diagnosis delivered with utter sincerity. The insult was so perfectly veiled in genuine concern that it took Thorne a moment to process it. The tittering stopped. Elise bit her lip to stop a laugh. Thorne's face flushed. Before he could retort, a calm, authoritative voice cut through. "Richard, bothering my guests." Arthur Vandermeer had materialized beside them, a silent apparition of power. Thorne's demeanor changed instantly. "Arthur, just making conversation. Your daughter's charming friend is quite a character." Arthur's eyes rested on Caleb. "Yes, he is." He turned to Caleb. "Mr. Miller, a word." He gestured towards a quieter alcove. Caleb followed, Elise moving to go with them, but Arthur held up a hand. "Alone, please, Elise."
She hesitated, but Caleb gave her a small, reassuring nod. In the alcove, away from the immediate crowd, Arthur studied him.
"You handled Thorne interestingly." "I told the truth," Caleb said. "That card does pull to the left." A faint, genuine smile touched Arthur's lips, gone in an instant. "You have passed the first test. You showed up. You haven't fled. You didn't punch a billionaire in the face, which is more than I expected." He sipped his bourbon. "But showing up is the easy part. The hard part is what comes after. The articles will be written tomorrow. The speculation, the pressure on Elise, on you, on your business. Can you withstand that? Can you protect her from the fallout of your presence in her life?" "I can try," Caleb said. "And I'll build something, sir. Something real. Not with her money, with my hands. Something that would make my father proud and maybe, eventually, something you wouldn't be ashamed of." Arthur was silent for a long moment. "Pride is not the issue, Mr. Miller. Safety is. Happiness is. My daughter believes you provide both. I am beginning to see a glimmer of why." He set his glass down on a passing tray. "The garage, the mortgage, the back taxes. I will not write you a check, but I will offer you a business proposition. My logistics fleet has a maintenance depot in Indianapolis. It is inefficient, overpriced, and the quality of work is mediocre. I am putting the contract out to bid. A small, qualified, local shop could potentially underbid the national firms and provide better, more dedicated service. It would be a multi-year, seven-figure contract. It would require expansion, hiring, certification. It would be brutal, demanding work. It is not a gift. It is a harder path than a check. But it is a path to solvency, to growth, on your own terms. Are you interested?" Caleb's mind reeled. A contract, a bid, work, not charity, a chance to earn his way, to build a future that could somehow, someday stand in the shadow of the Vandermeer Empire. It was a lifeline thrown not to the drowning man, but to the swimmer. "Yes, sir," Caleb said, his voice thick. "I am very interested." Arthur nodded. "My head of operations will contact you on Monday. The bid process is fierce. You will likely lose, but you will have had your chance." He turned to go, then paused. "And, Mr. Miller, the next time you see Richard Thorne, you can tell him his car's alignment problem is due to a worn idler arm. Common issue on that model." And then Arthur Vandermeer melted back into his party, leaving Caleb standing alone, the din of the gala sounding like a distant ocean. Elise found him a minute later, searching his face. "What did he say? Are you okay?" Caleb pulled her into his arms, right there in the alcove, not caring who saw. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair. "He gave me a chance," he murmured into her ear. "A real one." The rest of the night was a blur. Caleb stayed until the end, by Elise's side. He shook hands, endured more veiled insults and curious stares, and answered questions about engines with a patient honesty that disarmed more people than it offended. When they finally left, walking out through the gauntlet of flashing cameras, Caleb kept his arm around Elise, his head high. The headlines the next morning were brutal. "Grease Monkey Prince Charming. Vandermeer Heiress's Blue-Collar Beau. Is this the end of the Vandermeer dynasty?" But there was also a smaller article, in the business section. "Local Muncie garage vying for Vandermeer logistics contract. David versus Goliath story in bidding war." Derek and Chad saw the articles. They showed up at the garage Monday morning, not asking for work, but offering it. "We know we don't deserve it," Derek said, looking at the floor, "but we're good with numbers, with logistics. We helped run the telecom office. If you're going to bid on this, you'll need help. Let us help. No pay until you win the contract. Just let us try to fix something." Caleb looked at them, then at the massive stack of bid documents from Vandermeer Operations that had just arrived. It was a mountain. He couldn't climb it alone. He nodded. Get to work. The following months were a whirlwind of punishing labor. Days were spent fixing cars, keeping the existing business afloat. Nights and weekends were consumed by the bid, financial projections, equipment lists, certification paperwork, service plans. Elise was there most evenings, not with her trust fund, but with her sharp mind, helping to decipher legal jargon and organize the chaos. Caleb taught her about torque specs, she taught him about profit margins. They built the bid together, brick by painful brick. It was during this time, in the quiet exhaustion of a late night, surrounded by spreadsheets and coffee cups, that Caleb truly fell in love with her. Not the billionaire's daughter, but the fierce, smart, stubborn woman who believed in him. And she fell in love with the man who wasn't just a mechanic, but a builder, a leader, a man of quiet, unshakable integrity. The day the bid was submitted, Caleb stood with Elise, Derek, and Chad in the garage office. They were all exhausted, hollow-eyed, but there was a fragile hope in the air. "We did our best," Caleb said. "That's all we could do." The waiting was agony. A week later, a black sedan pulled up. Not Arthur, but a severe-looking woman who introduced herself as the Vandermeer Logistics COO. She toured the garage, asked sharp technical questions, scrutinized everything. She left without a word. 2 days after that, the phone rang. It was the COO. "Mr. Miller, the bid review is complete. Your technical proposal was surprisingly robust. Your price was competitive. However, your lack of scale and certain certifications were significant drawbacks." Caleb's heart sank. He felt Elise's hand slip into his. "However," the COO continued, "the board was impressed by the narrative, the story of a legacy business, community ties, and dedicated ownership. We are willing to offer a 1-year trial contract for the maintenance of our regional light-duty fleet, with a performance review for potential expansion. It is a fraction of the full contract, but it is a foot in the door. Do you accept?" Caleb's vision blurred. "Yes," he said, managing to say, "we accept." He hung up and turned to the small team. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a cheer erupted. It was small, it was just a trial, but it was a start. It was a future. That night, Caleb took Elise to the Rusty Nile. They sat in the same booth. "We did it," she said, squeezing his hand. "You did it," he corrected her. "We," she insisted. They were halfway through their burgers when the bell on the door jingled. Arthur Vandermeer walked in, alone, wearing a simple trench coat. Every head in the diner turned. He ignored them, walking to their booth. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Stunned, Caleb and Elise slid over. Arthur sat, looking at the menu with mild interest. "The Miller Special, I presume?" he said to Caleb. Caleb nodded. He flagged down Marge. "I'll have the same." There was a long, awkward silence. Arthur finally spoke, his gaze on his daughter. "The trial contract was the board's decision. A sensible, low-risk choice." He looked at Caleb. "Do not disappoint them." "I won't, sir," Caleb said. Arthur nodded. Then he did something utterly unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph, placing it on the sticky table. It showed a much younger Arthur, in grease-stained coveralls, standing next to a disassembled motorcycle in a cramped garage. "My father was a professor. He hated this, thought it was beneath me. I loved it, the clarity of it. Before I built an empire, I built engines. I understand the appeal, Mr. Miller. I also understand the cost of choosing a different path." He looked at Elise, then back at Caleb. "Take care of her, and let her take care of you. That's all I ask." The food arrived. Arthur Vandermeer, billionaire, ate a greasy cheeseburger and onion rings with his daughter and the mechanic in a diner in Muncie. He didn't say much else. He just was there. And in that simple, profound act, he gave them the only thing that mattered, his presence, his silent, gruff acceptance. When he left, he shook Caleb's hand, a firm, equal grip. "The idler arm," Caleb said suddenly, remembering. "On Torn's car? You were right." Arthur's winter sky eyes crinkled at the corners, the barest hint of a true smile. "I usually am." And then he was gone. A year later, Miller & Sons Automotive had a new, small, spotless annex next to the original garage dedicated to the Vandermeer fleet. Derek and Chad were salaried managers, their loyalty fierce and hard-won. The mortgage was current. The future was a thing they built together, day by day. There was no fairy tale ending where Caleb became a tycoon. He remained a mechanic, but he was a mechanic with a thriving business, a family of sorts he had rebuilt from broken pieces, and a love that had been tested in fire and found unbreakable. And Elise? She started a nonprofit, using her knowledge and connections to fund
trade schools and apprenticeships, building bridges between worlds. She was Elise Vandermeer Miller, and she introduced herself as such with defiant pride. One evening, as Caleb closed up the shop, Elise waited for him under the buzzing Miller & Sons sign they'd finally been able to repaint. He took her hand, his own still bearing the permanent stains of his trade, and they walked toward their home. The past was a shadow, the future a road stretching out before them, and the present, this simple, hard-won, grease-stained, beautiful present, was everything. They had chosen each other. And that, against all odds, had made all the difference.